Good evening, everyone. And once more, I thank Overman Foundation for giving me the opportunity to deliver these talks. Today we begin the first chapter of part two of the book, The Future Poetry. What would be the ideal spirit of poetry in an age of the increasingly intuitive mind? That is the question which arises from all that has gone before, and to which we may attempt some kind of answer. Sri Aurobindo says. Now, the first chapter of the second part of the book, The Future Poetry by Sri Aurobindo, is the answer to the question of what we mean by the ideal spirit of poetry. And here, Sri Aurobindo has discussed poetry from this perspective, that is, of its spirit, and talking about the ideal spirit of poetry, we may venture to say that it is surely mantric. In fact, we began with Sri Aurobindo's discussion of the mantra, the very first chapter of the future poetry, and we can say all points and moves towards the philosophy of the mantra. And we have to remember that Sri Aurobindo talks of possibilities, though with a firm conviction that these will transform into hard reality in the future. Yet, the exact turn the future will take is not predictable to the full extent, because life and mind are uncertain, unlike the processes of physical nature, which can still be predicted, being mechanical. The gods of life and mind are incalculably self-creative, Sri Aurobindo says, which makes it difficult to predict with certainty what turn they will take, though some main lines of their working can be distinguished. Thus, it is not possible to foresee and say exactly what the poetic mind of the race will achieve. We can only surmise the possible paths the future poetry may tread, which recent poetry has paved the way for. Sri Aurobindo formulates his theory of the future poetry and says that it is different from others and is akin to a sacred or hieratic ars poetica, which was possible only in days of old when man was in nearness to and in touch with the divinity and received the accents of the divine wisdom on the height of his mind. Thus, we arrive at the theory of the mantra. And let us follow Sri Aurobindo once again for a fuller explanation of what a mantra is. It has already been defined as the highest and intensest revealing form of poetic thought and expression. The inspired seeing is attended by a realization also, the realization of the inmost truth of self or God or man or life or universe or experience. That is how the Vedic poets conceive of the mantra. And a mantra is expressed or uttered with the great soul rhythm, the chand. That is, the seeing and hearing is the same here in the mantric rhythm. The seeing cannot be separated from the hearing, and the realization cannot be separated from either of these two. In other words, the seeing, the hearing, and the realization are one act. About the formation of the mantra, one Vedic hymn declares, "The hymn of your affirmation, O Maruts, is fraught with my obeisance. It was framed by the heart. It was established by the mind, O ye gods. Approach these my words and embrace them with the mind. For of submission are you the increasers." Now, Sri Aurobindo, in an explanation of this hymn, says that mantra fashioned by the heart receives its just place in the mentality through confirmation by the mind. The mantra is not in its essential part a creation of the intellect. To be the sacred and effective word, it must have come as an inspiration from the supramental plane, termed in Ved rhythm, the truth, and have been received into the superficial consciousness either through the heart or by the luminous intelligence. This is his explanation in his book, The Secret of the Ved. For the expression of the mantra, the realization, the truth, must possess the mind, be in the soul of the poet or the human channel. In Sri Aurobindo's words, and I'm quoting, the mantra is born through the heart and shaped or masked by the thinking mind into a chariot of that Godhead of the eternal, of whom the truth seen is a face or a form. Unquote. And in the mind of the hearer who listens to a real mantra, three things must come together. Sight of the truth must accompany the hearing. The mind must be in possession of the inmost spirit. And as soon as the mantra is uttered, it must come home to the soul. It may sound mystical, but Sri Aurobindo says only this is how the birth and effect of the inspired and revealing word may be described. The Vedic rishis applied this definition to the highest kind of utterance, but it may be applied to any high outburst of a really great poetry. In one of his letters concerning his epic poem Savitri, Sri Aurobindo wrote about the highest kind of overhead poetry, that it might even enter into the domain of the infinite and inexhaustible, catch some word of the ineffable, show us revealing images which bring us near to the reality that is secret in us and in all, of which the Upanishad speaks. The one unmoving is swifter than thought. The gods cannot overtake it, for it travels ever in front. It moves and it moves not. It is far away from us and it is very close. So, poetry becomes mantra only when it voices the inmost truth in the highest power of the rhythm and speech of that truth. The Vedic and Upanishadic utterances are mantra because they reveal this inmost truth of things. These poets used the innate soul rhythms and the sacrificial speech, and it was cast up by the divine fire in the heart of man. Thus, one Rigvedic poet sang, Agnirasmi Janmana Jataveda, Gritang me Chakshuramritam ma asan. This is how he begins one of his hymns. I am the fire, I am from my birth, the knower of all things born. Light is my eye, in my mouth is immortality. I am the triple ray, I am the measurer of the mid world. I am the unceasing illumination, I am the offering. Or listen to another hymn where the seer says, It is not now, nor is it tomorrow. Who knoweth that which is supreme and wonderful? It has motion and action in the consciousness of another, but when it is approached by the thought, it vanishes. So, mantra is a divinely burdened rhythmic word which embodies an intuitive inspiration and in which we have the sight and the presence of the self, the divine soul forms, the Godheads which are born from the living truth. The modern age, a slave to materialism, utilitarian reason, may not endorse or believe in this philosophy of life. But Sri Aurobindo says the curious fact is that this very modern scientific age seems to be returning to some far off light, turning back to seek the thoughts of the Vedic mind. But times are certainly different, and the human mind today is more complex with the inheritance of many ages and an enlarged basis of culture and civilization. We have seen and experienced the material and vital reality of the world. Now we seek for spiritual reality, for the self, the spirit of man, and the universe. But it is not the seeking of the Vedic seer initially. We begin with an intellectual probing and then go for the effort at sight and realization within the self. This effort brings with it conceptions of the Godheads which take shape in the liberated soul of man, the Godheads of truth and freedom and unity, the Godheads of a greater will and power, of love and universal delight, of universal beauty, of a supreme light and harmony and good. And Sri Aurobindo further says that the modern age has already been touched by the first bright shadow of these things, and there's the promise of the tinge deepening with time. But there is a difference between the modern mind and the ancient, and the new vision is not remote and inward like in old times, but it's an effort to draw the Godheads to a close intimacy with our earth and the common life of man. And it is not exclusively in religion and philosophy, or it's not that the work is left in the hands of a few elites. Man today strives to bring these mysteries near to the common comprehension. This comes with its own defect, but that is, the higher thoughts, the mysteries, being made too common and outward, are deprived of their inner depth and light and beauty sometimes. This defect will pass though, Sri Aurobindo says. So, this turn towards the highest and the inner realization may lead to the creating of a race which will, as a whole, try to live in a greater truth and will be moved by another spirit. And when this age arrives, poetry will recover something of its sacred prestige of old. It's not that poetry of the common type ministering to normal and natural aesthetic motives will not be written anymore. That kind of poetry will still survive, but there may also emerge the poet seer, the seer creator, the poet who is a rishi, master singer of the truth, aerophants, and magicians of a diviner, more universal beauty, to use Sri Aurobindo's words. And he adds that the greatest masters of poetry in the great age played these roles. But this was not the sole motive for their poetry, as there were other demands too of the age upon them. The result was that the highest things in poetry have been only rare self exceedings in the past. But if in future the deeper and greater truth is in common possession, the poets, the masters of the rhythmic word, will sing on a higher level, evidently. They will capture the greater tones of which man is capable. And Sri Aurobindo almost promises, as he foresees himself, a greater age of man's living in the future, even though sometimes man may be swayed into a side path. But a new great age, more glorious than the past, is surely in the making. And poetry must lead man towards this. And in this divine task, Poetry shall find as its aids new views in philosophy, changed spirit in science, new revelations in music, painting, sculpture, architecture, new ideals in life, and new powers of a reviving religious mind, in Sri Aurobindo's words. The beginnings have already been made in this greater kind of poetry, as we have seen in the works of some modern poets like Whitman, Carpenter, George Russell, Tagore. And so, Sri Aurobindo declares, and I quote his words here: the idea of the poet who is also the rishi has made again its appearance. Unquote. But for this idea to flourish, a wider spreading of thought, a broader mentality is needed. And we may add here that Sri Aurobindo himself was a seer poet, a rishi, a true poet who uttered the mantra. But this is just an emerging power now, and the age and the race of mankind must help to make it permanent. However, mankind is turning towards the heights now, and the poets who shall lead us there are going to be the seer poets. Poets are interpreters who reinterpret the past, interpret the present, and point to the future and reveal the face of the eternal in and through these interpretations. So let us listen to a few words of Sri Aurobindo, the voice of the seer poet. In his epic poem Savitri, he writes, the mind of earth shall be a home of light, the life of earth a tree growing towards heaven, the body of earth a tabernacle of God. Awakened from the mortal's ignorance, men shall be lit with the eternal's ray, and the glory of my sunlight in their thoughts, and feel in their hearts the sweetness of my love, and in their acts my power's miraculous drive. So, this is intuitive, revealing poetry and voices the harmony of five eternal powers. Sri Aurobindo calls these the five sons of poetry, the five greater ideal lamps, which are truth, beauty, delight, life, and the spirit. Now, this is something very unique in Sri Aurobindo's philosophy of poetry, and he discusses and explains each of these in great detail in the final chapters of his book, The Future Poetry. The higher mind of the race is already turning towards some of these. For instance, intellectual progress includes a pursuit of truth in certain fields. But this limited truth does not satisfy the probing mind of man. Man has searched for and known much, but this is very little compared with the infinitely more which is still there to know. As it climbs from height to height, there becomes clear to its view all the much that is yet to be done. This was how the Vedic poets described the seeking of divine truth. And Sri Aurobindo says this applies to the mind of the modern age. Perhaps the great truth can be found and lived in some awakening of the self and spiritual being of man. Then man shall attain the fullness of a greater knowledge, and new states come into birth, covering upon covering, awaken to knowledge, till in the lap of the mother one wholly sees, as said one Vedic poet. Today, our view of the world and existence is changing. The mechanical view of the universe has taken a back seat, and man knows himself now to be more than mere transient thinking matter. Sri Aurobindo says, now we are moving back from the physical obsession to the consciousness of a greater self within us. But that is one side of the query. Modern man believes, and rightly so, in life and humanity too. In fact, Sri Aurobindo's own philosophy of transformation and integralism does not reject or leave out earth. On the contrary, he believes in transforming earth itself, raising it to a more perfect greatness. So we now believe in a creative will of life and action as the secret of existence. This kind of belief may allow for greater power of art, poetry, philosophy, and religion, though it has its own limitations and dangers too. Now, Sri Aurobindo gives the instance of a Vedic hymn where Aditi utters these words to Indra, the new spirit about to be born in her womb. This is part of old discovered again, by which all gods rose up into birth. Even by that upward way shouldest thou be born in thy increase. But go not forth by this other to turn thy mother to her fall. But the new spirit may reply in these words, by that way I'll not go forth, for it's hard to tread. I have many things to do which have not yet been done. Now, if that happens, then it may end in a catastrophe, though great things will have been done. And spirit and life are not incompatible. In fact, Sri Aurobindo says, greater power of the spirit brings a greater power of life. And poetry, most of all, can bring home this truth to man with an illuminative force. Poetry and art are born mediators, Sri Aurobindo says, between the immaterial and the concrete, between the spirit and life. Philosophy cannot accomplish this task always, as it may lose itself in abstractions, and religion also may turn to otherworldliness and asceticism. But poetry of the future shall function chiefly as the mediator between the truth of the spirit and the truth of life. About the other two lamps of God, beauty and delight, Sri Aurobindo says that they are also spiritual and bring out the very heart of sweetness and color and flame of the other three suns of poetry. But our age has dimmed the lamps, and to the extent that the outward, utilitarian mind does not even feel its absence. Truth and life can be made perfect only when suffused with the power of beauty and delight, as they are its secret essence. Even the spirit has no full revelation without the presence of beauty and delight. Delight, Anand, is the very essence of the being of the spirit. And beauty and delight are the very soul of poetry and art. And Sri Aurobindo explains further that the whole significance of poetry, its spiritual function, is to liberate man into pure delight and to bring beauty into his life. The highest beauty and delight are one with the highest truth. Thus, poetry will enter most completely into its heritage when it arrives at the richest harmony of the five sons of God: truth, beauty, delight, life, and spirit. And that can be when the poet sings from the height of the highest vision. Yet, wherever we stand, at whatever level of our ascent, we can have in our possession these powers, because the divine self of man is always there, and poetry is one of the means by which this self or spirit manifests itself. Thus, the essence of poetry remains the same always. And whatever it is the poet sings about, the essential power and magnitude of the genius may be the same, whether it is Homer chanting of heroes in God moved battle, or Shakespeare writing in his surge of manifold color and music and passion of life, or Dante errant mid his beatific visions of hell, purgatory, paradise, or Valmiki singing of the ideal man and egoistic giant, or Vamdev and Vishwamitra voicing the actions of the gods, glories of the truth, and the battle and journey to the light. Of course, these are Sri Aurobindo's direct words, needless to say. The genius of the poet will always seize on some truth of being or life or spirit and give it a shape and a form for our delight as much as for his own, whether that be from the inspired imagination or inspired reason or high intuitive or spiritual vision. So, here is an example of the inspired high imagination when Dante describes the almost indescribable beatific vision of Beatrice in Paradiso. And he writes, and here we have some beautiful lines of poetry. I saw her face aflame with so much light, her eyes so bright with holy happiness, that I shall have to leave it undescribed. As in the clearness of a full mooned sky, Trivia smiles among eternal nymphs who paint the depths of heaven everywhere. I saw above a myriad of lights one sun that lit them all, even as our sun illuminates the stars of his domain. And through its living light there poured the glow of its translucent substance, bright, so bright, that my poor eyes could not endure the sight. So, in lyrical notes and with delicate imageries, the powerful vision is painted before us. Or take these from Shakespeare, words of inspired reason set in a poetic rhythm. Between the acting of a dreadful thing and the first motion, all the interim is like a phantasma, a hideous dream. The genius and the mortal instruments are then in council, and the state of man, like to a little kingdom, suffers then the nature of an insurrection. This is from his very famous play Julius Caesar. But the poet who can see from a higher height can give much more to fully satisfy all that we are. So we can consider these lines from Sri Aurobindo's Savitri here, where he writes, all from his stillness came as grows a tree. He is our seed and core, our head and base. All light is but a flash from his closed eyes, and all wise truth is mystic in his heart. The omniscient ray is shut behind his lids. He is the wisdom that comes not by thought. His wordless silence brings the immortal word. So, this is what we demand from poetry, which is the most complete of all the arts and the most subtle of all our means of aesthetic self expression. And that is how Sri Aurobindo defines poetry here. There are hints of what the high function of poetry is in the works of some modern poets. And if these promises are fulfilled along these lines, then the poetry of the future will kindle the five lamps of our being. our whole being shall be raised high, and the realms revealed, which are now hidden from our sight. And these will then shine as suns, illuminating our widest and our inmost life. The future poetry will be of a new and larger vision of man and self, and nature and God, and of the possible realization of all in a diviner manhood of man. The poet of the future will sing of these from beyond the level of the imaginative intelligence and ecstatic sense, and an intenser light from the heights shall illuminate his creation. Sri Aurobindo declares that the future poetry will be first and most the poetry of the intuitive reason, the intuitive senses, the intuitive delight soul in us. The poet shall have a greater poetic enthusiasm, got from an enhanced source of inspiration, and may rise to a greater power of revelation. The poetry may then come from the direct source of the overmind, which is the origin and source of all creative inspiration. And Sri Aurobindo has a unique theory of the overmind and overmind inspiration, which we shall go into details in our next talks. But here I may quote a passage from Savitri, which may be said to have been written from that source. And Sri Aurobindo writes, the lines that tear the veil from deity's face, the rhythms that bring the sounds of wisdom's sea, immortal figures and illumined brows, our great forefathers in those splendors moved. And in one of his letters, he wrote about some lines of poetry. He selected some from world literature, which suggest direct descent from the overmind consciousness. For instance, this one line from Virgil: the touch of tears in mortal things. So, we'll discuss overmind inspiration in our future talks. So, poetry of the future need not be remote or intangible, but shall endeavor to bring the highest things near and visible, and include in its creation the whole being and existence of man, from the most material sheath to the very inmost self. Include the finite, the infinite, the transient, the eternal. All this shall be done with a new reconciling and fusing vision. When the poet sings of the heights, he will not exclude the earth below it, and also he shall not remain confined within the earth only. He shall endeavor to find other realities, sing of all the planes of existence. The poet of the future shall not only discover new secrets, but will also take up the secrets of the older poets and transform them and transfigure the older rhythms too with the voice of his own deeper spirit. And in his progress from the past and present to the future, the poet will create new harmonies, reveal other powers and spirits of language, and find his own art of poetry. This shall be the real endeavor and the ideal endeavor of the poet. And Sri Aurobindo says that this kind of an attempt itself is a rejuvenating elixir for the creator. And once more shall the poetic spirit be the guide of the ever progressing soul of humanity. It will lead the march to the heights like the Vedic Agni, the youth, the seer, the beloved and immortal guest, with his honeyed tongue of ecstasy, the truth conscious, the truth finder, born as a flame from earth, and yet the heavenly messenger of the immortals. And that is how Sri Aurobindo envisages the poet of the future. So, thank you so much.